I want to take you to the book of Proverbs. I was reading in my devotion, I went through parts of the Old Testament recently, and this was a part of my reading, and I just couldn't get away from it, and it just stayed with me. And I thought I knew what I was going to do all week long until this morning, and I thought, I'm not sure that's what I need to do this morning. But I'm going to do it anyway, so y'all just pray that it comes out okay. Okay, all right? So I want you to look with me in Proverbs, the first chapter. I want to start the very first verse. I want you to notice who wrote most of the Proverbs that are recorded in the book of the Scripture. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel. The purpose is for attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and patient or prudent life, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. Look at verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. The very next verse says, listen, my son, to your father's instructions, and do not forsake your mother's teachings. They will be a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. And then he goes on and continues to tell him to avoid certain kinds of people in his life and what he should refrain from. And then he goes into a definition of what wisdom will do for you in verse 20 and concludes that to the end of the chapter. And then look at chapter 2, verse 1. My son, if you accept my words and store my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom, applying your heart to understanding, and if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. So he gives us the process of understanding what it means to fear God and the procedure of moving forward in God. And then he continues on to describe what wisdom will do for us. And then look at chapter 3, verse 1. My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you prosperity. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablets of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. God is giving us instruction, but keep on going with me a little further to chapter 4, verse 1. Listen, my sons, to a father's instruction. Pay attention and gain understanding. I give you sound learning, so do not forsake my teaching. And then he goes back in time and says, when I was a boy in my father's house, still tender, and the only child of my mother, he taught me and said. I began to meditate on these passages, and I began to roll them over in my mind, and I had never thought of this before. In chapter 4, Solomon wrote this. David had already lived most of his life by the time Solomon was born. He'd had all of his kids up until that time. And as you know, Solomon's mother was Bathsheba, the only child that she had that we know of by David. And David has taught Solomon some of the principles and lessons that he had learned in life. He says, this is what my father taught me. And I can tell you, Solomon looks back in his life and he sees the path and he sees the problems and he sees the evidence of all the wisdom that David poured into him while he was growing up. He saw his brothers, he saw his sisters, he saw various members of his family try to destroy his dad. His brother Absalom rebelled against his father. His brother Amnon raped his sister. And the whole story is sordid. It's horrible. And so Solomon is looking back and he says, I've learned some lessons by listening to what Daddy told me. I've listened to him and I've paid attention to them. But look at what happened to Solomon. Until late in life, he did pretty good. But then his error began to take place and he forsook the wisdom that God had given him. He turned his back on what he knew. What I want to bring to your attention this morning is the importance of parents pouring into their children while they are young. Now, I know that the vast majority of you this morning don't have children at home. Most of you have grandchildren, and some of them are grown. Some of your grandchildren are still in school. They're still tender. They're still teachable. They're still pliable. They're still malleable in the hands of God and those who teach them and train them. And I will tell you this much, that by the time a child is 13 years old, he or she has pretty well developed their entire worldview that will never leave them for the rest of their life. It will take a major undertaking of God to convince a person beyond the age of 13 what's right and wrong and what's good and bad, and will change their direction toward God. Now, there are people that have done that, and I've seen it happen. Just a few years ago, we had a man in our church come down and get saved he was above 80 years old, gave his life to God, and stood right here and cried his way through to salvation. And he said, I've never felt this before in my life. That was a God's miracle. He is one of few that come to God at that age. So I'm telling you this for the benefit of parents who have children. And for those of you who are young, who know the Lord, you are blessed, because the whole essence of God's word tells us that the purpose of life is to fear God and keep his commandments. That's the whole duty of man, according to the writer of Ecclesiastes, which is Solomon as well. So we find that Solomon records his errors. He records his foolishness, the emptiness of life under the sun in Ecclesiastes. And he comes down to the last verse and he says, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. This is what it's all about. This is the bottom line. Cut through all the fat and get to the final word. Fear God and keep his command, because this is what it's all about. That's your whole duty. A few days ago, we were meeting in our small group over in the children's building with the young couples. And I gave them a blank sheet of paper and I said, I want you to write down the top 3 challenges that you're facing right now as a young family. The top 3 challenges that you're facing as a young family. 4 out of 5 couples said this the very first thing. All of them alluded to family or marriage in one way or another, but most of them said we need help on knowing how to keep our kids focused on God. We need help on knowing how to lead our children to follow Jesus. And so I want to be honest with you this morning. Parenting is not easy. It's never been easy. But it seems that it's getting more difficult because your children have so many options of things today that never happened in my youth, even a few years ago. The proliferation of social media, the instant access to everything going on in the world in a few seconds. Your kids know how to find it on the internet, and they will find a way to communicate with other people. And sometimes that communication is not good. But I want to bring to your attention this morning what I think to be one of the most important things that can happen in children, and that is the instruction, the example, and the life of their parents. I read this story, and it's one of the funniest stories I've ever read. It's an old story, I can tell you that, because if it happened today, they'd put this doctor in jail. A few years ago, this mother had this 10-year-old boy, and he was absolutely a monster. I'm talking about a monster. She took him to the pediatrician one day for a yearly checkup, and when he got to the pediatrician's office, he literally ransacked the office. He threw books off into the floor. He turned over tables. He reached for a file drawer cabinet and jerked it open and spilled things out of that file cabinet. He literally destroyed that pediatrician's office. Finally, the pediatrician got him in the examination room, and they went round and round. And in the process of that, he noticed that young Robert had cavities. He says, ma'am, you need to take him to a dentist, but I don't know any dentist that's going to take him. But there is one older dentist that I've heard that he is good with kids. He knows how to deal with children. I'll recommend him to you, and you can take Robert to this dentist. And so she did. On the arrival at the dentist office that day, Robert's already ready for battle. He walks into the dentist office, looks around like this, wondering what he can tear up. And the receptionist says, just go right on in. So they went right on back to the dentist office, and the chair was sitting there, and the dentist was standing there with his glasses kind of down on his nose like this. And he says, young man, get up in the chair. And Robert says, no way. He said, yes, sir. You get up in the chair because that's what I intend for you to do. Robert looks up at him with defiance and says, if you make me get in the chair, I'll pull my clothes off. He said, then take them off. So Robert proceeds to take off his shirt. He takes off his undershirt. He takes off his shoes. He takes off his socks. He's standing there barefoot with his hands crossed. He says, okay. He said, get up in the chair, young man. He says, nope. He said, I'll take my pants off. He says, take them off. So he pulled his pants off, took his underwear off. He's standing there stark naked. He says, now get in the chair. And Robert gets in the chair. And the dentist works on Robert's teeth. And he gets finished with Robert, and he says, you're free to go. And Robert says, where's my clothes? He says, oh, you can't have them back. I'm keeping them till tomorrow. His mother came in, he said, and she looked at Robert. He's standing stark naked. He says, you're free to go, ma'am. They walked out of the office into the waiting room, stark naked in front of all the people waiting in the waiting room, out to the car, got in the car, went home. The next day, the mother came back to get Robert's clothes. She went in and she said, you will never know how thankful I am that you did what you did yesterday. She said, he has blackmailed me for years, telling me if I made him do certain things, he'd take his clothes off, and you finally called his bluff. Robert never took his clothes off again. There comes a time in every kid's life when somebody's got to call their bluff. I have watched mothers try to coax their 3-year-old children. I'm going to count to 10. Mother, you know how to count to 10. How many times are you going to count to 10 or to 3 or to 5? I would recommend that you get you a Mr. Helper. Put it in your purse. It's called a wooden spoon. Just a flat wooden spoon you stir beans with. They're not heavy. They're not going to kill your kid, and they'll definitely not bruise them. But I'll tell you, they sure do burn when you slap them across the rear end with a wooden spoon or across the naked leg. Mr. Helper can get a message across. Now, I know there may be people in this room today that would absolutely disagree with everything I've said. But I'll tell you what I told our young couples 3 weeks ago today. I said, if your kids act that way, don't bring them to my house. Because I will not rearrange my furniture and take everything off the table so your little kid can come in and not tear up something. That's not what life is about. You need mama and daddy to have an evil eye. That when your son or daughter sees you look that way, he knows his rear end is in the fan. Because he's going to get it tore off when he gets home. You can't spank kids at a ball game. You can't discipline them in front of a crowd. Well, most of you can't. Some of you do. I'm sorry. There's a few people here today that are bold as a lion. They don't care who's watching. Bless God. That kid ain't going to act that way in front of everybody. Anyway, what I'm telling you is this. Children have to know when you mean business. And they have to know you mean business. And if you don't mean business, then save your breath and let them grow up to be juvenile delinquents, because that's exactly where they will go. And I can tell you, by the time a kid's 10 years old, if he hasn't had his rear end taken care of a few times, and you say, well, I don't believe in spanking. That's fine. But if you want people to despise your kids, just don't make them mind. Now you say, well, that's cruel. No, it's not cruel. Nobody likes kids that don't mind. Nobody. I think they're streaming this on Facebook. Dear God, look at what I'm going to get back this week. How many of you like kids that don't mind in your house? How many of you like to be around them in a restaurant? How many of you like to sit on an airline with them? Nobody's raising their hand. Everybody wants children that behave. You say, well, I have too many. Hey, man, I got to tell you something. I know Stephen Biggerstaff, he's a pastor. He's got 12 kids. 12. They have to have a van to take their family to the grocery store or wherever. 12 kids. They were pastoring a church down in eastern Oklahoma a few years ago, and one of my deacons was building a church for them. And he walked into this Ace Hardware store one day and mentioned Brother Biggerstaff's name, and he told David, he said, you know, first time I saw that preacher come with all these kids, I told my employees, hey, keep an eye on all them kids because they'll just steal us blind. There's 12 of them. He said, David, I got to tell you, that's the best mannered bunch of children I ever saw in my life. So those kids acted like soldiers. They walked behind their parents. They didn't go off on all different ways. They didn't drag stuff off the shelves. They weren't looking at things, putting it. Said, he's welcome in my store anytime. A few years ago, we had a staff member in our church had 6 kids. Those are the best behaved 6 children I ever saw. They sat right over there, and every one of them was set right straight up, and his little wife weighed maybe 100 pounds. And she'd go, I can't snap my fingers as loud as she did, but buddy, she'd go, and she'd point her finger, and those kids, it was like they had been shot with something, tased. 6 kids. It doesn't matter if you got 1 or 20. They all need to understand that mom and daddy are in control. Because when I got thinking about my service tonight, my study this evening, and I'm prepared for that, this kept coming over my mind. I couldn't get away from it. And like I say, I probably need to preach this to young couples just by themselves. But there's a lot of grandparents here. You let your kids have their way at your house, and that's wrong. That's wrong. Don't let them tear up your stuff. Don't let them get by with stuff, because then they got to go home and get a whipping. Because mom and daddy's not going to put up with it when they try to do it, and they just do it at your house. Isn't it funny? The kids will try whoever they're with. And I'll be honest with you, they know when persons mean business. They know when they can get away with it and when they can't. And if you'll call their bluff a time or two, I'll promise you they won't want no more of that medicine, because they don't like it. Solomon will look back over his life, and he said, I remember growing up in my father's house, and I remember what he taught me. I remember what he taught me. We teach our kids by the words that we speak to them. If you speak words of love and discipline to your children, they will honor that. They will respect it. They will know that you love them, but you mean business. And there's a difference between hurting a kid or being mad at a kid and taking out on a kid. You should never spank a child when you're angry, ever. Don't do it. You'll regret it. You'll regret it. Don't spank your kid because somebody told on them. Make sure you know the truth before you discipline your child. I'm telling you stories that happened to me, and I had to ask forgiveness of my own son for treating him in a wrongful way one time because I listened to somebody else's gripe and complaint, and I didn't ask him if he did it. I just took their word for it, and he didn't do it. Now, he got a whipping for it. And I went and asked his forgiveness for him, and I guess he forgave me. I'm just telling you. Children know when you truly love them, even if you have to be tough on them sometimes. And here's the problem. Not every kid is easy to raise. There were some that you could melt them with words. But there were some I know in this church, you had to get a baseball bat almost after them to make them behave. I mean, they wore out mom and dad's right arm, giving them spankings or setting them in whatever. But there are some kids you can just melt them by talking to them. They'll just, okay. And there's others you have to say, do you understand me? It's like the guy that had the mule one time, and he had this stick in his hand, and he's slapping this mule up beside the head. And this guy's watching him just whip this mule upside the head. He said, what are you whipping that mule for? He said, I ain't whipping him. I'm just trying to get his attention. You have to get their attention. You have to let them know you're talking to them. And as I looked at this passage, I realized just what Solomon is talking about. Look with me now in chapter 4. We're going to kind of digest this together. And I'm going to show you the greatest treasure of all. And this is where you as a parent come in with your children. This is where we develop. This is where we begin to grow. This is where we begin to understand life when we're children, when we begin to discern what is good and bad, what's right and wrong, what is tolerable and what is intolerable, what is acceptable, what's unacceptable. And as you go down through this passage, you're going to see the greatest treasure of all is to learn how to see God, or to see life from God's perspective. That's wisdom. Wisdom is not being smart. Wisdom is not having a lot of knowledge in your head. Wisdom is knowing how to put it into practice in a way that pleases God and that is honorable in life. That's wisdom. A lot of people have intelligence, but they don't have any wisdom. So you can get knowledge and you can get understanding, but an understanding really develops into wisdom. And that's where God says the greatest gift of all, the greatest treasure you'll ever have in this life is the gift of the treasure of wisdom and how to live your life properly. Look what he says, chapter 4. Look at verse number 5. Verse 4, lay hold on my words and you with all your heart. Keep my commands and you will live. That is pretty powerful. Lay hold of my words with all your heart. The whole idea of this is, parents, if you're going to bring up children, whether they're teenagers or little guys or whatever age they are, you have to be consistent with them. 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 Why am I saying this over and over? It's because people are not consistent. We usually react and we get real mean and we get real tough for a few weeks, and then we start leveling off and backing away and letting them get by with it again until next year at this time we're back at the same square and we're doing the same thing over again, and it's because we weren't consistent. If you will be consistent, your kids will know what to expect all the time. Let me throw this little thought in there for you. God did not call you to be your children's best friend. He called you to be their parent and their guardian. You can be their best friend, but you are to be their guardian and their parent first. And I'll tell you, when a parent truly raises up a child in the way that God wants them to be raised up, they will look back and say, this is what my father taught me. This is what my mother taught me. These are the wisdom that God gave me through my parents. You'll look back with favorable honors, respect. You'll look back with great numbers on your mom and dad because they will have done something in your life that will have earned the right for them to be your great friend. Do you understand that? And the older they get, the more you're going to change a little bit in that relationship. And I remember when Scott got out of high school and he started his adult life, got married. He's still my son. He'll always be my son. But I don't tell him what time he has to be home anymore. I don't tell him how fast to drive. I don't tell him this and that. I don't tell him how to run his business. Now we talk about life. Now we ask questions. How's it going? How's things going here? What's happening here? And he'll share. And if he wants me to help, he'll ask for it. And the kids will do that. They'll ask, what do you think, Dad? Where should I go? What do you think about this? If you were doing this, what would you do? That's the way they usually come at you. The whole idea is that the older they get, the more the transition, you hand them off, you give them the baton, they run with it. Now they got their kids to rear, and you're loving them and encouraging them and loving on your grandkids as your kids are raising your grandchildren. That's a blessing. But you've got to be consistent. He said, lay hold of my words with all your heart. Keep my commands and you will live. There's a promise to keeping the commands of God's family, of keeping parents' word. If you go back to the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 12, the sixth commandment says, honor your father and mother that your days will be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Exodus 20 and 12. Honor your father and mother. Bring honor to them so that what? Your days will be long. How do you honor your parents? By obeying them. Children, obey your parents, for this is right, Paul says. Bring up a child in the way he should go, Proverbs says, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. He will remember it. He may stray from it, but he will never forget what he grew up knowing as a child. And here's the problem. I see parents trying to fix their kids at 22 when they should have started at 2. And we wonder why they're out of control, why they're not living right. And part of that is because we were not consistent. We were not truly consistent. Another thing we have to be is we have to be an example. We can't say do what I do or do what I say, not what I do. That does no good. It doesn't do your kids any good for you to tell them not to drink when you got beer in the refrigerator. Doesn't do any good to tell them not to smoke when you smoke yourself. Doesn't do any good. Tell them not to do this when you do it yourself. How can they see that as an example? They don't, because kids grow up to be like their parents. They imitate them. They walk like them. They want to act like you. They want to write their name like you. Did you know that's how I learned to sign my name? By watching my dad. I love the way he wrote Meador, and it had a big D, had a big round. I just thought that was the coolest thing. So I thought, I'm going to learn how to write my name like Daddy. And I did, and I still do to this day. Nobody knows that. I never told that story. I signed my last name like my dad does. Dad looks different, but I signed it like him because that's the way Daddy always did it when I was a kid. And I thought that was the coolest thing, Joe E. Meador. And I made that Meador real big and did that thing. Kids want to be like their fathers. Boys want to be like their fathers. Girls want to be like their mothers. They imitate them. They walk like them. They act like them. You have to be an example. They're going to follow you whether you like it or not in one way or another. So make sure you're leaving a good path for them to follow. Make sure you're leaving good steps. I got to close out with this, but I wanted to share this with you in closing. He says, get wisdom and understanding. Don't forget my words or swerve from them. Don't forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. There's a blessing in living life to please God. There's protection. Love her, and she will watch over you. He personifies wisdom as being a person. Love wisdom, and wisdom will look after you. Love wisdom, and she will protect you. You see, a lot of the reasons people get in trouble is because they make bad choices. And we make poor choices based on our own simple words, our own simple ways, which is a way that is not under the control of God and under the control of discipline. And when that happens, people get in trouble. We make mistakes. We pay for it. That same person could have chosen another route, could have chosen another answer, and their life would not have had to suffer the consequences of that. And we live in a world today that no one wants to admit that it's their fault. We want to point a finger at somebody else's face. We want to say it's their fault and it's not my problem and it's your problem. And so no one wants to take responsibility. No one wants to take and accept the consequences of what comes when people do certain things or don't do certain things. But writer of Proverbs gives us in the first the first seven chapters, he addresses his children. And it is filled with instruction in righteousness and filled with things to avoid and things to embrace and ways to live, so that when they get older, they will look back and say, thank God for the foundation that has been laid under my life so that I can live a good life. So how are you taking care of your family, mother and dad? How are you taking care of your grandkids, grandparents? Do you realize that one of these days we're going to stand before God and give an account? And I close with this illustration. Years ago in the Christian Life and Faith magazine, 2 families were recorded and this story was written. In the year of 1677, a wicked man married a very immoral woman. Over the next 150 years, they had 1,900 descendants from that one union. Of these descendants, 771 were criminals, 250 were arrested for various offenses, 60 were thieves, and 39 were convicted of murder. 40 of the women were known to have venereal disease. These people spent a combined total of 1,300 years behind bars in the state of New York at the cost of $3 million. That was in 1667 or 77, long time ago. The other family was the Edwards family. The third generation included Jonathan Edwards, who was the great evangelist of the New England Reform and the president of Princeton University. Of the 1,344 descendants of the Edwards couple, many were college presidents and professors. 186 became ministers of the gospel, and many others were active in their local church. 86 became state senators, 3 were congressmen, 30 became judges, and 1 became the vice president of the United States. No reference was ever made of any of them ever spending time in jail or going to the poorhouse. It matters where you come from. And I say this and I close. You say, my family looks more like the first family. Well, then somebody's got to start a new chain. You need to be the first link in a new chain. Are you listening to me? I know some of you that are the first or second link right here today because I was there when you got saved. I know about you. And you're walking with God. So whatever the past looks like does not have to predict your future. You can become a new chain and start a new direction. And I hope you will. If you're not parenting correctly, start now. If you haven't done it, read books, find some help, get some resources, talk to some people, ask for counsel, pay attention, because it's just important for parents to pay attention as it is for kids to pay attention. How many of you know that? You leave today and you say, well, that was a powerful message. I'm glad those other people heard that. That doesn't do you any good. I'm not preaching to the other people. I'm talking to you. Every one of you. I'm talking to every one of you because here's the deal. This book was written for our admonition and for our encouragement upon whom the whole end of the earth has come. There are practical helps in the Bible. If you want to find a good parenting book, go to the Bible. It's right there. I'll promise you, it gives you all the war stories of the failed parents, and it gives you the good ones too. You know what not to do and you know what to do, so you can gain insight. You can gain understanding. Read your Bible for encouragement and for guidance on parenting, for marriage, for business, for anything that deals with life. It's the greatest go-to book there ever has been written because it's absolutely trustworthy and it's absolutely true. Put your trust in the right book. Gain insight as a parent and move forward. And then I close with this thought. Don't make excuses. Don't make excuses. Don't make excuses. Stand up, be a man or woman, and admit to it. I made a mistake. I did it wrong. I didn't do it right. Don't make excuse. Because one day, you'll look back on this service or something like this, and I hope you'll say, you know, that was a turning point in my life when I realized that wisdom to live right is the greatest treasure my kids will ever have. That I can pour into their life the right direction and the right teaching and the right discipline and the right instruction. And one day they'll look back on me and they'll praise God for me. And I promise you, there's not a parent here, there's not an adult here today that looks back over your childhood. If you had parents that kept you in a parameter and put guidelines for you, you look back on them and you thank God for it today. It was painful as it could be at a time, but it produced some good results. It wasn't easy, but anything worth having is never easy. And anything that's too good to be true is too good to be true. Good kids don't just happen. They're brought up in the fear of the Lord. Please stand with me.
That concludes today's broadcast of Bethel TV. You can view today's message in its entirety at www.duncanbethel.com. We would also like to invite you to join us Sunday mornings at 10:30 a.m. or Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. for our services. Thanks for watching, and God bless.